Good afternoon. We are very happy to have you here for our webinar of the COVID-19 series from the School of Public Policies and Government of Getúlio Vargas Foundation. I'm going to start directly because we have very few time and we are all very excited to hear from Professor Levitsky, and so we are going to be very direct. Steven Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt started How Democracies Died with a simple yet worrisome question. Is our democracy in danger? The challenges imposed by the virus to policymakers have made this question even more important. If we are now worried on how to save as many people as we can, it is also time to ask what will be the long-term consequences of the virus to states and to democracies. Coronavirus affects all of our lives, but as everything in our context of inequality, it didn't affect all countries or all people in the same way. Different institutional contexts faced the crisis in different ways. World leaders have responded to the crisis in ways that defy the rational choice assumption, or even reason itself. First of all, I want to thank Steven for the kind acceptance to our almost indecent invitation. We know it's too soon to be sure about anything in the future, but we also know our role as researchers and professors to give some answer to society. And if we can't, at least we can ask some good questions. That's the objective of the webinar series on COVID-19 of the School of Public Policy and Government of Getúlio Vargas Foundation. And now we will have some words from Professor Edson Kondo, Dean of the School of Public Policy and Government. Professor Edson.
Well, thank you, Graciela. And thank you very much, Professor Steven Levitsky. First of all, we apologize for the confusion last week, or a couple of weeks ago, right? And thank you very much for finding time to be with us again and giving us the honor of having your presence here at the Getúlio Vargas Foundation School of Public Policy and Government. As an alum of Harvard myself, particularly from the Kennedy School, and given that several of us have spent some time at Harvard, it's a privilege to have you speak at our school. When the COVID-19 threat is over, we hope you will be able to find the time to be with us personally. These are very difficult times and emotions are running very high due to recent political events, particularly here in Brazil. The Getúlio Vargas Foundation School of Public Policy and Government takes the responsibility of encouraging academic debate on public policy very seriously. And today, we are given the opportunity to engage in an academic debate with one of the world's most distinguished scholars on democracy. I hope everyone takes the opportunity to engage on the debate in a manner as objective as possible, as it is usual among us academics, or so we expect. In any event, I'm sure we are ready to the exciting debate ahead of us. And let me thank Steven again and send the word back to you, Graciela. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. We organized the webinar in a questions and answers system. For the first 40 minutes, Professor Tássia Cruz, Fernando Filgueiras and I, and the undergraduate students Arthur Benado and Ingrid de Almeida are going to address our questions and some of the questions we received in advance from the audience. After that, the audience may send their written questions in the questions and answers session, and Steven will answer as many as he can. I will ask the audience not to send questions yet to see if the questions are going to be addressed in the first round, okay? Right, he doesn't need presentation, but I'll do it anyway. Professor Steven Levitsky is the author of seminal works in Latin America and democracy, such as Informal Institutions and Democracy, The Resurgence of Latin American Left, Competitive Authoritarianism, How Democracies Die, and more recently, Institutional Weakness in Latin America. He is David Rockefeller Professor of Latin American Studies in the Department of Government of Harvard University. Welcome, Steven. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And I apologize for the confusion last week. I'm pretty sure it was my technical ineptitude that caused the problem.
Definitely not.
We are all in the same boat.
Again.
Okay, so we are going to start the questions with our undergraduate student, Arthur. You can go on, Arthur.
Hello, everyone. I am an undergraduate student at FGV, and I'm very honored for having the opportunity to be here. So, Professor Levitsky, my question is about fake news and democracy. We are facing a scenario of huge spreading of fake news. It seems there is a new wave of opportunism that's very connected with the pandemic coronavirus. The use of doubtful information to design public policy, even if it is democratic, brings a lot of damage to the society. So, this way of policymaking, besides the material damage, could contribute to a weakening of democracy?
Not sure I fully understood the question. They using false information or fake news as a means of governing?
Yeah.
Like in your country and mine.
Yeah.
Look, we face a challenge very broadly of a dramatic technological revolution in media and the dramatic rise of social media, which has revolutionized in a very short period of time how people get access to information. And that's made inevitable. It's made so-called fake news much, much easier to disseminate, and that's a challenge for democracies everywhere. And it just as radio was almost a century ago, or about a century ago, just as television was 75 years ago, when radio first emerged, and it more or less at the time, or not long before the rise of fascism in Europe, people were convinced, or many people were convinced, that radio was going to give rise to fascism everywhere. People thought television would give rise to widespread demagoguery and populism. And to some extent, obviously, it did. It was a challenge, but societies and polities, eventually regulators learned how to incorporate those media into democratic politics. And I think there's at least a chance, a decent chance, that societies will also adapt to new social media. It's going to take learning on the part of citizens. It's going to take learning on the part of politicians, and it's going to take a certain amount of state regulation. I think it's always, so I'm not sure it's the technology that's at the root of the problem. At the root of the problem in Brazil and the United States is we've elected presidents who are demagogues and liars, and who have a very little commitment to core democratic norms or institutions. And I think with or without social media, with or without WhatsApp or Twitter, these two presidents would be dangerous. They would be dangerous in any era. So let me leave it at that for now.
Great. Thank you, Professor Levitsky. Now, Ingrid, please. We have to, go on.
Okay, that's right. Hello, everyone. My name is Ingrid, and I am an undergraduate at FGV. First, I would like to thank you, Professor Levitsky, and the organizers of the lecture for the opportunity to be here. Professor Levitsky, my question is about transparency and the pandemic of COVID-19. The NIDIO Transparência Brasil showed that several countries face the difficulty of coordinating activities of public employees in remote control model. Also, there is a wave of countries that restrict the access to public information and data. As an example, in Mexico, the National Institute for Access to Information and Protection of Personal Data suspended deadlines for delivering the requested information. We all know the importance of transparency for the democracy order. We also have to consider the fragility of Latin American democracies, such as Brazil, where the culture of accountability and social control is still being built. Do you believe that in the region, these kind of restrictions can contribute this process of building a culture of transparency? In which ways can these restrictions impact democracy? Thank you.
I think we're, this is obviously a type of crisis that none of us in our lifetimes have confronted. Those of us who think a lot about democracy and think a lot about the challenges facing democracies, most of us had not spent much time thinking about how a public health emergency might challenge democracy. We thought about terrorism, economic crisis, hyperinflation, riots, civil war, had not thought about pandemic. So we're learning as we go. One thing about pandemics, maybe more than almost any other crisis, is it makes absolutely necessary at some points restrictions on basic liberties, right? You can have debates about whether in a context in other kinds of contexts, there's any justification for restricting my right to go out of the house or not. But in a public health emergency, in a case of a highly infectious disease, it's very difficult to argue against certain restrictions. So every democracy on earth, even the most democratic democracies around, have placed at least some restrictions on people's ability, people's individual rights to go to the movies or to a restaurant or to a park with a large group of friends. That seems reasonable. It seems inevitable as long as it is there's a societal consensus, a political consensus, and it is restricted to the period of time necessary. Transparency and the media, I think, is a very different issue. I think there's a much, much weaker justification for restricting media activities and for limiting transparency in the context of a pandemic. Some regimes have done it. You've seen it. Hungary has been an extreme case. Many authoritarian regimes have further restricted either media rights or limited transparency. And again, I have to say, I'm not even remotely an expert on how to respond to a public health crisis. But my initial response is that more rather than less transparency is necessary in the context of a pandemic, and that one realm of individual rights that almost certainly should be untouched in the context of a public health crisis is media freedom and access to information. And so regimes, governments that begin to encroach on those rights, one, I think they're damaging democracy, but almost certainly they're also damaging their society's responses to the crisis.
Great, thank you. Now, Tássia Cruz, professor.
Hello. Hi, Professor Levitsky. I'm Tássia Cruz. I'm an economist and I'm a professor here in the School of Public Policy and Government at FGV Brasília. Thank you so much for your time here with us. So I think it's a connected question, a little broader. Before the pandemic, we would see several policies held by countries when dealing with immigrants that we could consider as being racist and xenophobic. And on the other hand, we would also see in the past decades multicultural appreciation of diversity in the public sphere. So how do you see the pandemic affecting our globalized world? In other words, how do you think this whole new situation might affect our idea of nationhood and our openness to others, like immigrants, for example?
Oof. It's a big question, and involves a lot of speculation about things that I know almost nothing about. I think it's an open question. I think that in the short term, we're going to see many societies turn inward and restrict travel and immigration considerably. I think there will be an impulse, at least in some sectors of societies, at least in wealthier countries. I should limit this right now to the advanced democracies. I think there'll be an impulse to close down in the short run. Certainly, the U.S. government is going to try to take advantage of this crisis to close down immigration. But I think there'll also be counter movement. First of all, it's difficult for me to imagine seriously reversing globalization. I mean, it may be transformed. Institutions may be transformed, ways of doing it, but both economically, culturally, socially, technologically, it just seems very hard to go back to the previous century. I mean, international travel is going to slow down for a while, and it may never quite be the way it was, 6 months ago. But I don't think we can put societies back into the compartments, into the little boxes they were 50 years ago. Diversity in Europe, diversity in the United States is here to stay. And I guess the optimistic spin is that this will, that the pandemic will compel governments to invest much more seriously in international organizations, international institutions, so that we can cooperate more effectively. Now, again, governments are responding in very different ways. The United States response has been to at least threaten to stop funding the WHO, which is about in the list of governments doing all-time stupidest things in the middle of a pandemic, that's pretty high. It's almost as bad as the president getting on national television and recommending that people inject disinfectant into their bodies. So the U.S. response has not been particularly cooperative. But I do think in the medium run, when political elites, economic elites look at what happened and begin to plan for the future, that there'll be an impulse actually for greater cross-national cooperation. So I think you'll see impulses in both directions, and a lot will depend on politics. A lot will depend on public opinion in democracies, and I don't know yet what that will bring. I mean, there is the politicians in the United States are beginning, because we're heading to election, are beginning to stoke up anti-Chinese sentiments, blaming China for the virus, and they're trying to use that to win, basically win votes, to win the election, and that's pretty dangerous. So I think I see in the United States a bit of an impulse to close down, but the U.S. is divided, and in every democracy I know, there continues to be a pretty big constituency, what I would call a cosmopolitan constituency, an urban, educated class, in effect, that I don't think can imagine shutting down and turning inward.
Thank you. Let's hope.
Thank you. Now, Professor Fernando.
Okay. Professor Levitsky, hi. I am Professor Fernando Filgueiras, Professor of Public Policy and Government at FGV Brasilia. It is a great pleasure to have you with us. In one of your latest books, Understanding Institutional Weakness, with Daniel Brinksy and Vic Murillo, you point out the challenge of establishing a robust institutional design for Latin American democracies. In other words, there is a gap between rules and practices that causes state incapacity, non-compliance, and political stability. At the same time, new digital technologies are reinforcing the ambiguity of Latin American political regimes. Now, in the context of the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic, we are expanding surveillance, for example, through cell phone tracking, with the justification of expanding the monitoring of agglomerations of people. In the context of institutional weakness in Latin American countries, what is the danger of this ambiguity of digital technologies for democracy?
That's a great question. Fernando, it's great to see you. I'm a big fan of your work. this is a question that really we're just beginning to speculate about. It's a question I know very little about, but it's interesting how you link this. So I've heard a lot of debates and concerns about the rise of new digital technologies and surveillance capacities, and that governments may need or have good reason to expand surveillance capacity in the context of fighting the pandemic. But what does it mean for democracy? And my response, and so the link to weak institutions I think is really interesting. My response in general is I worry less about the technologies themselves than the regimes in which they're used. One can certainly imagine, and there are cases of democracies employing what might be very frightening surveillance technologies in a limited, regulated, non-politicized way. I don't worry terribly about the government in Finland or Denmark or Uruguay employing these technologies. But they need to be regulated, and there needs to be a hell of a lot of oversight. And in a context of institutional weakness, we grow less certain about whether political actors, state actors, will actually be regulated or whether there'll be effective oversight. So in a context of institutional weakness, I hadn't put these two together, but all things equal, I would worry much more about the deployment of surveillance technologies. That's a pretty vague answer, but that's my first cut.
Thank you. No, now it's my time. I think I didn't introduce myself. I'm sorry, I'm kind of nervous yet. Graziella Testa. I'm also a professor at the Public Policy and Government School of Getúlio Vargas Foundation, and I'm proudly a former student from Professor Levitsky. So I'm very happy to hear from him again. I miss our times of the Latin American seminars. It was a great time.
Me too.
So my question is about the role of parties in coalitional construction. You know that the issue of governability in Brazil is deeply related to democracy, because most of the interpretation of the military coup of 1964 considered the deadlock as a reason for institutional break. The coalitional presidentialism, in the coalitional presidentialism, president used it to build their cabinet by assigning ministerial roles to party leaders, Recently, this has changed, and new non-partisan movements tend to consider this kind of governability as a problem. So my question is kind of broad in this context. Can you imagine a democracy that works without or despite of parties?
Without or despite parties?
Yeah.
You just have to travel to Peru to observe a laboratory where where they're trying to make democracy work in effect without parties. It's not pretty. When parties disappear, not only you study legislatures, Graziella, obviously organizing legislatures gets much more difficult when there are no parties. It's more likely that the president will not have anything remotely like a stable majority in the legislature when there are no parties. So it's more likely, unless you dramatically empower the presidency, which some Latin American countries have done, you're likely to have a fair amount of executive legislative conflict when there are no parties. But there are other things as well. Peru has now gone 30 years without parties. Yes, 30 years. And turns out it's very difficult to sustain a political career when parties die every 5 years, roughly, as they do in Peru, 5 or 10 years, and you're with party A. If that party collapses, you either are not going to have a vehicle to get elected, or you're going to have to jump to another party. This is a practice that's has historically been somewhat common in Brazil, of switching parties. It's actually much, much more common in Peru. And Brazil looks like Sweden compared to Peru in terms of party stability and party switching. There are many politicians in Peru have switched parties 6, 7, or 8 times, as many as Bolsonaro. Everybody's a Bolsonaro in Peru. They don't behave like Bolsonaro, but they party switch like Bolsonaro. And eventually it just tends to fail. People don't like party switching. It's ugly. It looks too opportunistic. And it turns out political careers end early. It's very hard to stay in politics for more than usually 10 years or so in Peru. And increasingly, the political class is made up of amateurs, of outsiders, of people who jump in through the window because they were business people, or they were well-known athletes, or they were well-known journalists, or they're religious figures. They were somehow made their money or their fame doing something else, and then they jump into politics. And the product of a politics that is dominated by amateurs is not very pretty. All of that said, I think that political parties are almost certainly weakening across the world. And I don't know if everybody's headed towards Peru, but we might be headed towards something like Israel, where parties are very fluid. Politicians remain in politics. They sort of, but coalitions are very loose, and parties are often renamed and reconfigured at every election. And so it's much more fluid. It's not without parties. It's not without structure, but it is the alignments, the offers, the debates are quite different at every election. And I think that's probably a world where we're headed to, where what you don't have are institutionalized, rooted parties. You have much more fluid and unstable parties. That will be messier. It'll take a certain process of political learning by politicians, but presumably politicians will learn how to make it work. One issue is that a big issue facing really most of Latin America, certainly Brazil, is what is the glue that can hold coalitions together if it's not giving people's access to steal from the state, or even patronage jobs. And could it be policy, as we read in the textbooks, the way it should be, or the way it is in the political science textbooks? I don't know. Is power enough? I mean, in Israel, things are a little less corrupt. It's mostly about it's mostly about policy and power. But the key is, I mean, I don't think it's hard for me to imagine. You guys know much better than I. It's hard for me to imagine Brazilian democracy functioning in the medium term without some sort of coalitional presidentialism. But it's going to have to be a different form of coalitional presidentialism. It's going to have to be a coalitional presidentialism based on something beyond the spoils of the state. And that is the challenge, is whether politicians can figure that out quickly enough before citizens get so sick of them that they reach for something else.
Yeah, great. I'm going to jump to my next question, because you just talked about this. It's about the coalitional formation in multi-party presidentialism, especially this that we used to call coalitional presidentialism in Brazil. Now, I may be biased, but it seems to me that the literature on coalitional presidentialism in Brazil didn't consider the peculiarities of informal institutions. Particularly the difference on how they change. All Brazilian presidents until today have built their Congress support by sharing ministerial chairs with parties, although this practice is not written anywhere, has never been written. The most recent government chose not to do so and is now facing a deadlock after deadlock. Do you think informal institutions are necessarily weaker than formal ones because of the uncertainty on how they change?
I'm not sure they're necessarily weaker in all contexts, but I think I would have to think more deeply about this. But they're certainly easier to violate in a very public context, like a national legislature, when the political actors and their behavior is, you know, covered on a day-to-day basis by the media, as opposed to a whole other area, other areas of life where monitoring is much lower. Here, monitoring is very high, right? And so violating formal rules in that context is often quite difficult, costly, particularly where you have opponents that have power to enforce or to both monitor and enforce. Whereas informal rules are ultimately much more breakable. Not everybody's aware of the rules, and you know, you cannot, and there often are limits to the cost or the punishment that is made to you when you violate an informal rule. There is some, but it's not quite the same. So I think for example, in the legislature, informal rules are probably weaker in general than formal ones. But that said, presidents who have violated the kinds of informal rules that you work on, Graciela, in coalitional presidentialism, those presidents have fared very, very poorly. They have always failed, right? I mean, they're not sent to prison, they're not impeached immediately, but no democratic president has widely violated those informal rules and made it to the end of her or his term.
Great, thank you. Now I'll ask the audience if they want to send questions. You can send the questions on the questions and answer session that I will do as much as I can to Professor Levitsky. But first we are going to have one more question from Tasia and then one more question for Fernando before the audience question. So Tasia, please.
Professor Levitsky, I'm going to continue in this same discussion of institutional strength and the political stability. And I would like to hear you comment about the importance of this institutional strength, and particularly in terms of political stability, to the next step after the pandemic in terms of public policies. What do you think, how this instability we are going through may affect our ability to deal with the consequences of the pandemic in terms of economic and social effects?
When you say the instability you're going through, do you mean the political instability or the institutional instability?
Both. I'm talking about Brazil, but
I assume you mean the crisis in the Bolsonaro government.
Not only, I mean also the institutional instability that you were mentioning in terms of the coalition, the informal rules. So not only the political instability.
Well, let me start generally. I don't know how much insight I'm going to have on the Brazil case, but you know, institutional instability or institutional stability is not always a positive thing. Sometimes institutions are too stable for their own good, and key elements of society seek change, and they're unable to change institutions quickly enough because they're so strong. I mean, the United States is now grappling with a set of democratic institutions that are really not functional. They're very strong. Some of them have existed for more than 200 years. Americans tend to treat our Constitution like the Bible, like something that was given by God that we can't change, which is borderline insane. But it's very hard to change. So we have things like the Electoral College, which increasingly is giving us presidents who lose the election, but are awarded the White House. That's a serious dysfunctionality, and yet we're having trouble changing them. And you know, I think the Chilean constitution, the Pinochet constitution in Chile, is another example of a set of institutions that grew too strong for their own good, and contributed to a massive, really societal uprising prior to the virus. So strong institutions are not always good. That said, there does seem to be a lot of variation in democracies responding to the current crisis. And it does seem that democracies whose core institutions are pretty functional, and certainly whose social policy institutions are relatively strong, are in better shape. I mean, so the response in Germany, for example, compared to the response in the United States, is very striking. You know, Germany is still hit hard by the crisis. Germany's still going to suffer an economic crisis. There's no easy way out for the Germans either, but their response has been so superior to that of the United States, and I think that looking forward, they're in a much better position to dig out of the public health crisis and the economic crisis. So Brazil is, you know, similar to the United States, but worse in that the level of institutional weakness is greater, and the level of social inequalities is greater as well. So, you know, for all of Latin America, this is going to be a devastating public health crisis and a devastating economic crisis. And I guess one has to make a distinction between the short and the medium term. In the short term, responses are kind of all over the map. Some governments, it seems like populist governments responded pretty badly. Populists tend to have they get to power because they reject the elite, they reject the establishment, and in many cases, they reject intellectuals and experts. And so in the case of AMLO in Mexico, and I think Bolsonaro in Brazil, you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, the initial response, in fact, the first and second and third response was to really sort of reject reality, which is terrible. So the Peruvian response was the opposite. The President Vizcarra was very, very quick, very prompt to respond. It was pretty largely as good a response as you could ask for in the situation. I don't know if that's going to help Peru in the medium or long run, though. I mean, when you have a weak state, when you have weak social welfare institutions, limited tax capacity, a relatively weak rule of law, I think the structural weaknesses of the Peruvian state are such that no matter how well President Vizcarra responds, Peru's going to be in huge trouble. The flip side of that are countries like Costa Rica and Chile and Uruguay, which probably, Uruguay, those countries responded reasonably well anyway, but they have a much better structural capacity to respond. Brazil's in the middle. The initial response has been horrendous. The Brazilian state is in much better shape than those in Central America and the Andes. So the combination of a kind of a medium case in terms of state capacity and a terrible response, it doesn't bode terribly well. To resolve to have to deal with a severe political crisis, a government that's either falling apart or threatening democratic rules and norms at the same time that you're responding to the crisis. I mean, the United States is something similar, but it looks like Brazil's political crisis could be much more serious. And it's hard to look into the future and say exactly how much of an impact that will have. Not good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Professor Fernando, if you can make it short for we to have time for the audience too, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay. Professor Levitsky, my question is a big question in sequence of your answer to Tássia. And this question don't have a single answer. But I do. How can countries like Brazil strengthen their institutions and create a solid institutional design to face society's challenges? How can critical situations like pandemics accelerate the process of institutional change?
Could you repeat the second part of the question, Fernando?
Second part? Yeah, okay. How can critical situations like pandemics accelerate this process of institutional change?
So I think the easiest, so the how part is difficult. But I think to take a half a step back, I think you're right. The second part of the question begins to answer the first part, in that you asked, how do you get stronger institutions? How do you reform institutions? I mean, this is something that Dan Brinks and Vicky Murillo and I have been looking at now for several years, and we're continuing to work on. And it turns out it's really hard. It's very, very hard to build strong institutions, especially in a context where institutions have been weak for decades and sometimes for centuries. It's difficult to take a state like Guatemala or Ecuador, to take extreme cases where regime and sub-regime institutions have been weak literally for 2 centuries, and build strong institutions upon them. Brazil is not in that kind of an extreme place, obviously, but crises are one way. Now, crises can do, to overgeneralize, to oversimplify, they can push in either direction. Crises can weaken institutions. My fear is, given where United States politics are right now, this crisis may further the erosion of our institutions, but they also create an opportunity to strengthen them. I mean, one thing that's clear, I mean, it's very, very difficult in the context of normal politics to dramatically strengthen institutions overnight. I mean, I think Brazil, you may think I have too rosy a picture of it, but when I look at Brazil from 1985 to 2010, that is a case of a quarter century of slow but pretty steady institutional strengthening. So institutions can strengthen, but it takes time. A crisis creates an opportunity to do it more quickly. I think more often than not, it has a weakening effect. But particularly if a government or a coalition is able to respond to the crisis in a way that enhances public trust, then they've got at least an opportunity to build institutions that people buy into. The problem is that sometimes it's the government that responds effectively is authoritarian or populist or personalistic, and therefore uses that public legitimacy to weaken institutions. For example, Fujimori in Peru helped to respond to a crisis, but he did it in a way that weakened institutions. I fear that Bukele in El Salvador will be similar, that he may earn a fair amount of public trust, but he'll do it in an anti-institutional way. In Brazil, you've got a bad president responding badly, so I don't think we have any danger of anybody strengthening institutions in the short run, for good or for bad. But the key, I think, is developing a coalition that can actually, for example, this is a crisis that I think creates an opportunity and maybe even a serious need to address issues of inequality in Latin America, right? This is a crisis that even the IMF says it compels governments to raise taxes on the wealthy. The IMF is saying that. If a government takes that seriously, and a government uses this crisis to seriously invest in redistribution, perhaps at a time when economic elites are a little weaker or unable to defend themselves in the same way, that could have some interesting effects. But this is all speculation and stuff that's politically very difficult. So in Peru, there's some discussion of this. The economic elite are already rejecting the idea of higher taxes.
Thank you. Now we are going to I took the questions that people made and I organized it in some categories here. So we have lots of questions on civil liberties. We have Kate Maloney, a former student of yours, who is in Middle East and she's saying that some non-democratic countries haven't done the strict lockdown that we've seen in democracies. And then she asked, could there be a reason why non-democratic countries that don't have a popular mandate have a harder time getting citizens on board for lockdowns? And in the same area of civil liberties, there's Weber, our professor, Weber Recchia, who wants to know about the limits on civil liberties and how do you see the connection between these rules, democracy, and freedom? And the third question about that, it's from Lara Dalladea, who asks if these policies, these lockdowns, this kind of liberty restriction can be considered as a deprivation of our individual freedom and consequently an attack of the democracy that we are so proud of.
Okay, great questions, tough questions. That's a really interesting question regarding authoritarian regimes and lockdowns. I guess to begin by reversing the question, I think democracies have had an easier time than many people suspected in getting people to comply with pretty hardcore lockdowns. When this whole thing first started, and when the Chinese Communist Party imposed a dramatic lockdown in Wuhan, there was some initial discussion about how democracies couldn't do this. You had to be China to carry out a stay-at-home policy, and that turned out not to be true. Turned out democracies could do it. I think it was easier for smaller, more homogeneous, and more legitimate democracies to do it than some others. The United States had a harder time than some smaller Western European countries, but clearly democracies have, with sufficient transparency, information, and legitimacy, are able to do it. In fact, very, very few democracies were, completely failed. I think authoritarian regimes are all over the map. Some of them are fully able to do it. They have sufficient legitimacy and sufficient capacity to do it. Others due to a mix of either insufficient legitimacy, insufficient capacity, or maybe just fear, are unable to do it. I think another thing that's occurred in at least some authoritarian regimes, though, is that the regimes themselves don't have enough information. That in a number of personalistic autocracies, the leaders are slow to get accurate information from their own states. And so it's not necessarily an incapacity to impose lockdowns, but they're slow to realize that they need it. So from what I've seen so far, it's not, we started off thinking, democracies will respond one way, autocracies will respond another way. It turns out there's much, much more variation. Some democracies responded very quickly, very strongly, others did not. Some authoritarian regimes responded very quickly, very strongly, others did not. It depends more on state capacity for one. It depends a bit more on state-society relations. So other variables beyond regime seem to matter more. In terms of civil liberties, I guess, that's been an argument in the United States. The last question, whether the response to the public health crisis will kind of permanently endanger democracies by restricting civil liberties. That's an argument made by a minority of sort of hyper-libertarians in the United States. Those are the people who are protesting out in front of governors' mansions, that saying that we should open up the economy, open up now. They have rejected stay-at-home orders from the very beginning. You see that in a few other places, but I've not seen any evidence in established democracies that the restrictions that governments have any intention, any desire, any intention to make permanent or to take political advantage of these restrictions of civil liberties. Interestingly, in every democracy I've seen, there's overwhelming public support, public consent to these restrictions. And again, established democracies, whether it's Costa Rica or Uruguay or Denmark or Finland, I have not seen any evidence that there is a sort of an undemocratic consequence to these restrictions. Now, there are other places like Hungary or El Salvador where governments are taking advantage of the crisis to restrict other liberties. So I get that the governor of Massachusetts doesn't let me go and organize a big party in a bar with 200 people. I cannot understand why the government would say I don't have the right to publish my opinions in a blog or a newspaper or write a newspaper column or get access to information. So there are other civil liberties, particularly in the area of information and press freedom, that I think it's completely unjustified, that restrictions during this crisis. Now, an area where it begins to get more murky is the right to protest, right? There's a good, legitimate public health reason to restrict individuals at the height of the pandemic from gathering in large crowds. Here in my state, you're not allowed to have, I think, groups larger than 50. Now that, of course, is music to the ears of any autocrat, right? A rule that says no crowds are allowed to gather is a great way to criminalize protest. And so that's the great concern. And the only remedy to that, the only way to figure out under what circumstance constraints on protests are justified or a threat to democracy, I guess, is two. One, do they have a very clear time limit? And two, is there political consensus behind it? So if a government is going to restrict the right of people to associate in public, they sure as heck better negotiate that restriction with the political opposition. That would make me feel a bit safer in terms of preserving democracy. That has not happened, for example, in Hungary, and nor has it happened in El Salvador. I guess I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Now we have a few minutes and we have a lot of questions, so I'm gonna ask for, already I'm going to be sorry for the ones we are not be able to read or anything, but I grouped some questions for which to answer as most as we can. So there are three groups of questions now. One regarding parliaments and centralization during the crisis. Another group that there are lots and lots of questions about populism and the crisis, and at least elections and local government. About populism, we have Paulo Ricardo do Vale, Luciano Sobral, and Gabriel Menezes talking about the relations of the crisis and the centralization, maybe the erosion of democracy. Paulo will ask, populist regimes tend to use the pandemic as a common enemy for concentration of power. Would you put Brazil and its current president in that group? Do you think that Brazilian political system and its institutions, but particularly the institutions of control and balance, are capable of maintaining a movement of the president in this direction? Luciano Sobral wants to know, hi Luciano, if populist leaders are taking the opportunity to further erode democratic institutions, and gives the example of Hungary and Philippines, the same examples that Gabriel Rezende gave. So I think it's a little bit about populism now.
Okay. So I think there's a lot of variation. We've seen a lot of variation in terms of how governments, and call them maybe potentially authoritarian governments, populists, have responded to the crisis. People paid, Hungary got a lot of attention because that was maybe the starkest example of an already autocratic leader taking very quick advantage of the crisis to push the country further towards dictatorship. There are certainly signs of that in Philippines. Again, I worry a lot about El Salvador, but it has not really been terribly widespread. And it's usually been in cases of regimes that are already moving in an authoritarian direction. We don't see in other democracies, whether it's Chile or Peru or Ecuador or Costa Rica, we don't see the same movement everywhere. And in fact, populists who I think populists I'm defining as political outsiders who come to power with a sort of militant anti-establishment, anti-elite appeal, have had very, very mixed performance in response to this crisis. As I mentioned earlier, some of them, and I would include Trump, Bolsonaro, AMLO, and probably Erdogan in Turkey, some of them have responded very badly to the crisis. They were slow to take advice from experts. They had sort of these personalistic, semi-anti-science responses, a certain amount of denial for several days, in Bolsonaro's case, several weeks. And as a result, their performance has been somewhere between bad and terrible. Putin is another case of this. Not exactly a populist, an authoritarian who has not responded well. The dictator in Belarus, Lukashenko, has responded poorly. And I think there may be a medium-term effect that's not so terrible for democracy here, which is that these populist and potentially authoritarian governments, if they perform badly in responding to the crisis, will undermine their own public support and lose legitimacy. So in the case so Trump and Bolsonaro, for example, are two of the only presidents on earth that I've seen, elected presidents on earth, who did not get a significant boost in public support from the coronavirus crisis. Almost every government, every prime minister and president on the face of this earth got an increase in their approval rating somewhere between 10 and 25%. Merkel, Macron, Boris Johnson, oh my God, I'm forgetting Piñera in Chile. His approval rating was -4 before the crisis, and that rose to 20. He got from basic, not even his mother supported him before the coronavirus, and he rose to 20%. So most governments got a boost in public support. Bolsonaro did not, and Trump had a very small one, already disappeared. I think AMLO is in a similar circumstance. So poor performance could actually weaken. So we worried. We looked at Hungary and we worried that the situation should be crisis, populist takes advantage, concentrates more power. And that's true in Hungary. It's true in El Salvador. It seems to be true in Philippines. In other cases, it's been crisis, poor response, poor performance, loss of public support, and perhaps weakening. I think that may be true in Brazil. It may be true in Mexico. It may be true in the United States. Donald Trump's position vis-a-vis in the coming elections is weaker today than it was three months ago. Turkey's another case. Erdogan responded badly. Turkey's performance has been pretty bad, and I think it has undermined his support and potentially created an opportunity in the medium term for redemocratization. So maybe I'm too optimistic, but I see a very mixed story, and I see a number of populists who've performed poorly and who may be weakening themselves.
Oh, but we need so much optimism now, Professor Levitsky, that it's well received by us. Can we have 5 minutes more?
Sure.
Okay, so the last question, the last theme, I think it's very important. Jailson is asking about elections. Given the needs for social distance and the uncertain times of the pandemic, what are the greatest risks you see to the forthcoming American presidential elections? What steps can be taken to ensure that a fair and representative election takes place in November? That's also a good question for Brazil. Yeah,
it's a great question. Good question to end on. So obviously one of the greatest tests or one of the greatest threats is that an autocratic government could use the crisis to cancel or postpone elections. In Latin America, the biggest concern that I have right now is in Bolivia, where you have a de facto government that emerged out of a coup, which was supposed to be a transitional government, already was violating a fair number of democratic norms, used the crisis pretty legitimately, but still, nevertheless, used the crisis to postpone an election that would hopefully allow Bolivia to redemocratize. So we don't know where that will go, but that a worst case scenario is that the crisis allows an autocrat to cancel or postpone elections. That's not going to happen in the United States. What can happen in the United States is something so maybe crazier, which is that obviously in a public health emergency, in a pandemic, voting in the physical act of voting is potentially difficult, dangerous, risky. And so people might not want to vote. Now, again, and the United States has a very peculiar electoral system. First of all, voting is voluntary. Turnout tends to be relatively low. Secondly, voting is very, very localized. It's run by local communities, and the people who actually run the electoral process are retired people, are old people who are volunteers. People who are 70, some of them are like 120 years old. The people who actually check you, register you as you show up, give you the ballot, and observe you. They're very old. Those people, those good souls, are probably not going to want to come out and work if there is an epidemic. And so it could very plausibly be in November of 2020 that conditions in many places in the United States are such that it's not safe to vote, and there aren't election workers, and so they have to reduce the number of polling places, which means that there are long lines to vote, because instead of 100 polling places in the city of, say, Boston, there are only 5. And so there are big lines, and of course, big lines are a health risk, and so people won't vote. That's a real danger. So there's an obvious solution. It's not easy, it's not cheap, but there's an obvious solution. That is voting by mail. We know, and 5 states in the United States already have large-scale voting by mail, where any citizen who wants to vote by mail can, but not all states have that, and it's not easy in many states. So there needs to be a law passed at the national level, a policy massively funded. I think the estimates are that it would cost, I think, $2 billion. I'm not sure. And it needs to be done with anticipation. It needs to be done 6-7 months in advance, so that states and local governments can implement this policy. I think what I fear most about this election is that the Trump administration will simply refuse to act. It's not that it will take an active stance, that it will not actively cancel elections. It will not actively postpone elections. It'll simply cross its hands and do nothing. And by doing that, knowing that what will happen, it will permit an election that is either low turnout or possibly totally chaotic. The way things are looking, it's very hard to predict the future, but it now looks like Trump is behind in the polls. And I think if Trump thinks he's could lose the election, he will essentially roll the dice, he'll take a gamble, and he'll bet on a totally chaotic election in which people are afraid to vote. And because in a normal, if in a normal election he would lose, maybe in a chaotic, low turnout election, he could win. And the brilliant thing about that is he doesn't have to do anything wrong. He doesn't have to break the law. He doesn't have to break the rules. He doesn't have to be authoritarian. He just has to sit and refuse to do anything.
Good and old non-decision making.
What?
Good and old non-decision making power.
But the thing is, it's legitimate, right? Americans have this, we have this almost religious-like attachment to our existing institutions. Americans are very, very conservative when it comes to institutions. That's good and bad. It means that our institutions are stable, which is often very good. Unlike Argentines that change the rules of the game every time there's a crisis. We keep our institutions, but it's also bad because we're always very, very reluctant to change the rules. And so whenever someone says, well, we need to change our voting system so that we can vote in a pandemic, people say, oh no, we've always voted this way. We've always done it this way. American democracy is 200 years old, blah, 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 blah. We can't change anything. And that has a certain echo among the public. And so Americans' reluctance to engage in institutional change, our conservatism when it comes to institutions, works in Trump's favor. It means that sitting back and refusing to do anything, just keeping things the way they were, will be legitimate. That's the great danger. This is what keeps me up at night thinking about November.
That's great. Thank you very much, Professor Levitsky. We have now a few words from our dean again. Then you can end our lecture. Professor Edson Kondo.
Well, thank you very much again, Steven. I would like to also thank the panel members, Tasia, Fernanda, and Graciela, and the two undergraduate students, Arthur and Ingrid. Thank you for all the participants, very interesting questions, and we apologize for the inability to answer all the interesting questions. Finally, Professor Levitsky, thank you again for the opportunity to engage in the discussion of problems and challenges related to the impacts of COVID on the health of democracies, and what all the governments and countries are trying to do during this pandemic. And then again, we keep our invitation for you standing when the COVID crisis is over. Thank you very much.
I'm going to take you up on that invitation.
Yeah, that's what I want to do too. I want to thank Professor Steven one more time for the availability and kindness always. We hope to see you personally here in Brasilia when things get better. We also want to thank the audience for the excellent questions and great debate. We at the School of Public Policy and Government wish that you stay healthy and in peace in these difficult times. We have to say that in every email right now as well, because you never know what everyone is going through in this moment. Next week, we are talking about the effects of the COVID on education in Brazil. Stay tuned in the FGV media for further webinars of the series. Thank you very much, Professor Steven.
Thanks, everybody. Those were great questions. Take care.
Take care.